welcome back to Roll for Geekiness in a new season of the Deck Brewers Cauldron, the series where we talk about some of our favorite Magic the Gathering decks and the cards and combos that make them tick. I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to talk about my Goblin deck. Goblins are a classic go-wide aggro type. They always have been. They favor making lots of tokens, buffing them up, and overwhelming opponents. There's nothing wrong with this, and Quince may at some point talk about their Krenko Mob Boss deck. In fact, there's a ton of support for this archetype. However, when I sat down to build a Goblin deck, I wanted to do something different, or at least find a different axis. And that is when I stumbled across Ib Halfheart, Goblin Tactician. Ib Halfheart, Goblin Tactician costs 3 and a red for a 3/2 Goblin Advisor. He has a triggered ability that says whenever another goblin you control becomes blocked, sacrifice it. If you do, it deals 4 damage to each creature blocking it. He also has an activated ability. Sacrifice 2 mountains, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. That first ability is the most interesting one. When I attack, if my goblins are blocked, they essentially become slightly worse goblin grenades against each of their blockers. In short, this deters my opponents from wanting to block, or at least block with stuff that would ordinarily squish a 1/1. It forces my opponent to make the choice between taking 1 damage or having 4 damage dealt to their blocker. Suddenly the math is different. And then we go from algebra to trigonometry by adding cards like Mechanized Warfare, Gratuitous Violence, and Fiery Emancipation. Now we're adding or multiplying the damage, whether that goblin is blocked or not. Now any blocker might get blown up by my explosive carrying gobos, and my opponent has to choose between a solid hit to the chin or watching their whole army go up in flames. Let's jump to calculus, with cards like Goblin War Drums, Invasion Plans, and Caterwauling Bogart, or Berserker's Frenzy, Grappling Hook, and Goblin Grappler that give my creatures menace or force blocks in certain ways. Now my charging bombs can hit multiple targets at once, or even target troublesome pieces that my opponents might rather not block with. You might have noticed that I'm buffing my damage as a whole, rather than buffing up my army as a whole, like many Goblin decks do. And part of that is because of the math. I want the choice of 1 damage to me versus 4 damage to my creature to look like a no-brainer. That way, cards like Banners Raised, Haze of Rage, Mercadia's Downfall, Tears of Rage, and more can be used to keep my opponents guessing. The other reason is because, like many red aggro decks, I'm running Cavalcade of Calamity and Raid Bombardment. On top of that, I know my goblins are likely to die, so Bogart Shenanigans, Brazen Cannonade, and Pashlik Mons also do a lot of work. Of course, the real work of many Goblin decks is done on the back of many Goblin creature tokens. And this deck is no different. There are 20 cards in this deck that generate tokens, many of them repeatedly, including Ib himself. In fact, Ib has the ability to turn many late-game land drops, which don't tend to be very useful in less mana-intensive decks, into creature advantage. And I've leaned into feeding that engine with pieces like Wayfarer's Bauble, Traveler's Amulet, Navigation Orb, Explorer's Scope, Expedition Map. Of course, all of Ib's tactics don't work half as well without him around to shout his catchphrase, "Everybody but me, charge!" So protecting him with the Boots and the Greaves and the usual contingent of red redirect spells is important. On top of that, keeping a Goblin Chirurgeon around is very useful. Now, overwhelming opponents with goblins is certainly a game plan, but so are cards like Goblin Warstrike, Massive Raid, Mob Justice, and, in a pinch, Last-Ditch Effort and Goblin Bombardment. There's certainly a teensy bit of subtlety to dig into, but I'll let you see for yourself. at the full deck list linked below. As with all of my deck lists, you can see all of the categories that cards fall into, as well as a list of cards that I have cut and a list of cards that I might still consider in future revisions. And, as always, we'd love to hear your ideas and stories about our friend Ib.